He had been mopping the same floors for 11 years. Every single morning, 5:47 a.m., before anyone else arrived, he was already there, bucket in hand, head down, eyes on the ground. The kind of man people look through, not at. The kind of man who became so much a part of the background that after a while, people stopped seeing him at all. The way you stop seeing the chairs in a waiting room, or the hum of an air conditioner that's always running. The nurses barely nodded at him. The doctors walked past him like he was part of the furniture. Even the security guard at the front desk, a man named Brody who prided himself on knowing everyone, had stopped bothering to learn his name years ago. He was just the janitor, quiet, invisible, forgettable. But on a cold Tuesday morning in March, everything in that hospital was about to change, and the man everyone had ignored for over a decade was the only one who could stop a tragedy that nobody else even saw coming. The man behind the mop. His name was Walter. No last name on the badge, just Walter. Maintenance. He'd been working at Mercy General Hospital since he was 52 years old. Now he was 63. Lean, gray at the temples, with the kind of quiet economy of movement that comes from decades of physical work. Every gesture purposeful, nothing wasted. His hands were steady in a way that was almost unnatural. Not even when he was carrying a full mop bucket down a wet corridor did they ever seem to shake. The hospital itself was a large one, 6 floors, 3 wings, over 400 beds. It served a city that never quite slept, which meant the building never quite slept either. Maintenance was a round-the-clock operation, and Walter worked the early shift by choice. Always had, from his very first week. He was there before the breakfast trays came up from the kitchen, before the overnight nurses handed off to the day team, before the attending physicians arrived in their pressed coats, with their coffee cups in their confident strides. He was there before all of it. Moving through the empty corridors in the gray pre-dawn light, mop and bucket in hand, like a ghost who had chosen to stay. Nobody really knew where he came from. Human Resources had a file on him, of course. But files at Mercy General were long, and staffing was chronically understaffed, and nobody had ever thought to read Walter's carefully. He had passed his background check. He showed up on time. He did his job without complaint and without drama. That was all anyone needed to know. He ate his lunch alone, always the same corner bench near the loading dock, tucked between a steel door and a row of industrial bins. A thermos of black coffee, always black, no sugar. A sandwich wrapped neatly in foil. And sometimes a paperback novel with a worn-out spine and dog-eared pages. The kind of book that had been read more than once. The kind of reader who went back. The younger staff had a habit of talking about him the way people talk about a neighborhood landmark they've always passed but never entered. Not cruelly, more like he was a mild, persistent curiosity. "Do you think he has family somewhere?" one of the first-year nurses asked once during a slow afternoon. "I heard he once fixed the entire HVAC system on the 3rd floor himself," said another. Like actually fixed it, not just patched it. The engineers couldn't figure it out for 2 weeks. Walter looked at it for 20 minutes and then just sorted it. "He speaks differently when he thinks no one's listening," said a third. "More precise, like he's choosing every word." The conversations never went anywhere. They'd dissolve back into the noise of the shift, into the next patient, the next alarm, the next crisis demanding full attention. Walter would continue mopping, and the mystery of him would remain exactly where he seemed to want it, tucked quietly out of sight. There was one person who had always noticed Walter, though. Really noticed him. Not as a curiosity, but as a person. Her name was Dr. Claire, a second-year resident who had arrived at Mercy General 18 months ago, full of fire, and the particular bone-deep exhaustion that never quite leaves you during residency. She was the kind of doctor who memorized patients' names and asked about their children, who stayed an hour after her shift ended to finish charting rather than leave it for the next person, who had cried exactly twice in the hospital parking lot, and both times gone back inside anyway. She had noticed Walter during her very first week, not because of anything remarkable, just because he had smiled at her, a real smile, not the reflexive, polite kind, when she was struggling to steer an oversized equipment cart through a doorway that was 6 inches too narrow for it. Without being asked, he had walked over, assessed the problem in about 2 seconds, held the door at a slightly different angle, and then guided the cart through with a small adjustment to the approach. Clean, effortless, like it was obvious. "Thank you," she'd said, slightly breathless. "No trouble at all," he'd replied. That was the entire exchange, but she had never forgotten the way he said it, calm, unhurried, like a man who had long since made peace with the fact that most problems have simple solutions if you just stop panicking long enough to actually see them. After that, she always said good morning when she passed him, and he always said it back. In 11 years of working at that hospital, no one else on staff had made that a consistent habit. It was a Thursday evening, 3 weeks before everything changed, when she first saw something that lodged itself in her mind and refused to leave. She had stayed late to finish a stack of charts. The ward had gone quiet. The day shift was long gone, and the night staff were settled into their routines. She was walking down the 4th-floor corridor toward the elevator, coat over one arm, bag over the other, thinking about nothing in particular. She passed the supply room. The door was slightly open, maybe 2 inches. She almost kept walking, but then she heard a sound, not a voice, the soft, deliberate sound of a page turning. Then another. She pushed the door a little wider. Walter was sitting on an upturned supply crate near the back wall, underneath the single fluorescent light that hummed faintly overhead. On his knees, open and carefully supported, was a book. Not a paperback novel, a thick, heavy medical text, the kind that medical students carry in both arms because one isn't enough. His reading glasses were on. His finger was moving slowly along a line of text, with the precise focus of someone who not only understood what they were reading, but was cross-referencing it against something in their own memory. He looked up, not startled, not embarrassed, just calm. "Long shift?" he asked, as if she were the one who needed checking on. She blinked. Yes. What are you reading?" He closed the book with the same careful attention he'd given to opening it, and she caught the title on the spine before it disappeared. Pharmacological Interventions in Acute Cardiac Events, 3rd edition. "Just something that interests me," he said simply. She wanted to push, wanted to say, "Walter, that's a specialist cardiology text. That's not light reading. That's not a curious person flipping through a medical book they found in a break room. That's someone who already knows what's in it and is going back to confirm something specific." But something in his quiet eyes stopped her. Not a warning exactly, more like a closed door that wasn't locked, just not currently open. A door that would open in its own time if she waited. She nodded, said goodnight, walked to the elevator, and spent the entire drive home thinking about that book. About his hands, so steady. About the way he'd said, "Just something that interests me." The way a surgeon might say it. The way someone trained to be precise with language might say it, when they decided, very carefully, to say as little as possible. The day nobody expected. It happened on a Tuesday. The morning had started in the ordinary way. The particular controlled chaos that any large hospital generates before 9 a.m. Patients arriving through the front doors, overnight cases being handed over, rounds beginning on every floor. The cafeteria already out of the decent coffee, replaced by the thin, burnt kind nobody liked, but everyone drank anyway because there was no other option. Walter was on the 2nd floor, replacing a faulty fluorescent panel near the east stairwell when the alarm went off. Not the standard PA chime, the full alarm, the evacuation signal, cycling in long, insistent pulses through every speaker on every floor. Everyone within earshot knew instantly that it wasn't a drill, because 30 seconds after the alarm started, the smell arrived. Sharp, chemical, the particular wrongness of something burning that should never burn. The backup generator room in the basement had developed an electrical fault overnight. A frayed coupling near the main panel had been arcing quietly for hours, undetected, slowly heating the air around it, until it finally sparked directly against a shelf of chemical cleaning supplies. The resulting fire was not large, but the smoke it produced moved fast through the hospital's ventilation system, and within 4 minutes of the alarm, the second and third floors were filling with a thin gray haze that thickened with every passing minute. Evacuation protocols activated immediately. Staff began moving patients. Elevator access was automatically cut. The stairwells filled with the sound of footsteps and urgent voices, and the particular tense efficiency of people who had drilled for this, but were discovering, as everyone does, that the real thing feels nothing like the drill. People were moving fast, too fast in places, and in the chaos, something went wrong. Room 214 was near the middle of the second-floor corridor. The patient inside was 67 years old, 3 days out of double bypass surgery. He was stable, had been doing well, actually, well enough that his surgical team had cautiously started discussing a possible early discharge by the end of the week. But he was still on a continuous IV medication drip, a precise, timed infusion that managed his post-operative heart rhythm. The kind that could not simply be yanked out and reconnected 10 minutes later without risking a cascade of complications. Moving him without proper preparation, without the right equipment and the right hands, risked triggering an arrhythmia that could become a cardiac arrest in under 2 minutes. The 2 nurses assigned to the second floor had been separated in the first wave of the evacuation. One pulled to assist with a patient on a gurney who'd started to seize, the other gone to retrieve emergency equipment from the far supply closet. The attending physician for the floor was already on 3, dealing with a patient who'd panicked and pulled out his own IV line. The covering resident had been redirected to a priority case at the other end of the building. In the space of 90 seconds, room 214 had gone from supervised to abandoned, and then, in the chaos of the evacuation, a gurney being rushed down the corridor had been released by a staff member who turned to help someone else. It rolled sideways and jammed itself diagonally across the door to room 214. Not locked, but effectively blocked. Not the kind of blockage that would stop a determined adult from pushing through, but in the noise and the smoke and the urgency, nobody pushing past in the corridor had time to stop and investigate a door that looked, from the outside, like it was simply closed. Inside that room, the patient lay in his bed, listening to the alarms, watching gray smoke begin to curl in under the door, and understanding with the terrible clarity of a man who has just survived major heart surgery that nobody was coming for him. His heart monitor began to spike. Walter had been 15 feet away when the gurney jammed the door. He'd seen it happen, had called out immediately, sharp and clear. But the alarm was too loud and the corridor too crowded, and his voice was just one more sound in a building full of urgent sounds. Nobody turned. The evacuation flow pushed past him like a current, and for a moment, he was the only still point in it. He didn't hesitate. He moved to the gurney and shifted it in 4 seconds, not with force, but with the efficient leverage of someone who understood the geometry of the problem immediately. Then he opened the door and stepped inside. The smoke was thin but present. The alarm was reverberating off every hard surface. The patient was upright in the bed, both hands gripping the rails, eyes wide, breathing fast and shallow. Exactly the kind of breathing that precedes a cardiac event in a post-surgical patient. "Am I going to die?" the man asked. His voice was steady, but only just. "Not today," Walter said. He said it the way he said everything, without performance, without false brightness, just as a statement of fact that he intended to make true. He went straight to the IV line, check the flow rate against the pump display, check the medication label. His eyes moved with a speed and precision that had nothing to do with guessing. He was reading the numbers the way someone reads numbers they have spent years learning to read, filtering the relevant data from the irrelevant in the time it takes most people to find their glasses. He calculated the safe window for temporary rate reduction, adjusted the pump, checked the secondary line, confirmed the oxygen saturation reading on the monitor. Then he released the bed brakes, repositioned the IV pole so it would travel cleanly, double-checked that no lines were caught or crimped, and began moving the patient toward the door. He talked the entire time, low and even, not loud, just enough to be heard over the alarm. He described exactly what he was doing and why. He told the patient his heart rate was holding. He said the smoke was already lighter in the corridor. He said they were going to take the east stairwell and that someone would meet them there. He didn't promise things he couldn't guarantee, but he kept talking because he knew, from somewhere deep in a knowledge he had spent years trying not to use, that a calm voice in a frightened patient's ear was one of the most effective cardiac interventions available. Dr. Clare was on the second-floor landing of the east stairwell, helping direct a stream of patients downward when she saw them come through the door. Walter, pushing a hospital bed single-handed through the smoke-hazed corridor, one hand on the rail and one steering the IV pole, talking quietly to the patient the entire time. She stood absolutely still for 1 full second. Then she moved. She reached them in 8 strides. "Walter, what did you—" She stopped herself. Not the moment. She went straight to the patient, checked his pulse, checked the IV, checked his color, his breathing, his eyes, pulled up the monitor reading on the portable unit still attached to the bed. Stable. Elevated, understandably, but stable. The IV rate had been correctly adjusted. The lines were clean. His oxygen was holding. She looked at Walter over the patient's head. "How did you know what to do?" He met her eyes. There was no pride there, no bid for recognition, just the same steady quietness she had first noticed on her very first week at Mercy General, when he'd helped her with a stuck cart and said no trouble at all, and meant it. "I used to know," he said, "a long time ago." She held his gaze for a moment longer than the situation strictly required. Then she turned back to the patient, and together, she and Walter, they moved him down the stairwell and out of the building to safety. The fire was contained within 40 minutes. A small burn in a basement room, dramatic in its smoke but limited in its actual damage. No patients were seriously hurt. The evacuation, by every official measure, was a success. In the incident reports filed that evening, the rescue of the patient in room 214 was noted. Attributed to quick thinking by maintenance staff, the paperwork moved on. But Dr. Clare went back to the supply room on the 4th floor that night, before she left the building. The medical textbook was still there, on the crate where Walter had been sitting 3 weeks earlier. She picked it up, opened it to the inside front cover. There was a name there, written in faded blue ink. Neat, precise handwriting, the kind developed over years of writing in charts, in reports, in the margins of research papers. Walter H. Graves, M.D., Department of Cardiothoracic Surgery, Johns Hopkins Hospital, 1987 to 2009. She stood there for a long time in the quiet supply room, holding the book, reading that name. 22 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon at one of the best hospitals in the country. And then, nothing. A gap where a career should have continued. And then, 3 years later, a maintenance position at Mercy General. No fanfare, no explanation. Just Walter showing up one morning with a mop and a thermos and asking where he should start. She set the book back on the crate exactly as she had found it, and she left. She found him the next morning at his bench by the loading dock, 6:15 a.m. The hospital was just beginning to wake up around them. She sat down beside him without asking. He shifted slightly to make room, which was as much of an invitation as she was going to get. For a while, neither of them said anything. The loading dock hummed with the sound of an early delivery being processed somewhere around the corner. The sky above the parking structure was the flat pale gray of early morning. She didn't ask about 2009. She didn't ask why he left medicine, or what had happened, or whether he missed it. Those were his questions to answer if he ever chose to, and they were not the point of why she was sitting there. "You saved his life yesterday," she said finally. Walter looked at his thermos. He would have been fine. Someone would have found him. "You don't know that." A long pause, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose I don't." She nodded, stood up, pulled her coat tighter against the morning cold. Then she turned back. "I don't know what brought you here, Walter, and I'm not going to ask. But I want you to know something." She paused, finding the words carefully the way he always seemed to find his. "I think this hospital is better because you're in it. Whether you're holding a mop or a scalpel, or just reading a book in a supply room at 10 o'clock at night." He said nothing, but something shifted in his face, something that lived a long way down, behind the steadiness and the quiet. Something old and tired and, for just a moment, less alone than it had been. Not quite a smile, but close. There was no ceremony, no announcement over the PA, no meeting in the administrator's office where Walter stood at the center of a room full of people applauding. That wasn't the kind of story this was. This was a story about a man who had once held a scalpel and saved lives in operating theaters with his name on the door, and who had then, for reasons that were his own, put the scalpel down and walked away from all of it, and found his way, in the slow, quiet way that some people find their way, to a different kind of showing up. The hospital administrator did eventually read Walter's file, really read it this time, all the way through. What happened after that is a longer story, one with more chapters, but this is the part that matters. For 11 years, Walter had arrived every morning before the sun, had moved through those corridors with his bucket and his mop, and his steady hands and his watching eyes. Had fixed things that weren't his job to fix. Had held doors. Had noticed what other people were too busy or too important to notice. Not because he had no other options, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because somewhere in that building, on any given morning, someone needed something. And Walter had decided, quietly, stubbornly, without making a thing of it, that he was still the kind of man who showed up to give it, even when nobody was watching, especially when nobody was watching. The janitor nobody noticed had been the most important person in that building all along. They just hadn't been paying attention.